The greater Islamophobia is the warmongering that happens in the Muslim majority world, that also could not have happened had it not been for the demonization and vilification of a people. This nation could not have invaded Romania or Ukraine or Germany today the way it did Iraq, simply because we were told, or they were told, there may be weapons of mass destruction. Maybe, so let's just invade a country and hundreds of thousands are killed, and for a whole 5 or 6 or 7 years or even a decade. This process of vilification is important for us to understand. Islamophobia is not a new phenomenon. It goes back to the beginning of the relationship between the Muslim majority world and the West and Europe, where there was suspicion and fear between one side and the other. And it goes on through the ages, through the process of what we call, or what Edward Said calls, Orientalism, the notion that for the Western scholars and Western leaders and Western opinion shapers look at the Muslim majority world only through the prism of exotification and through looking at what is different rather than what is common, otherizing. And it goes on and it culminates after 9/11 with the perception of some that all Muslims, or the majority Muslims, or Islam itself as a religion and a culture is to blame for what happened on 9/11, and then to begin to string together events in history to form a narrative of the big bad other Muslim that has consistently in history been violent and hateful and abusive of others and has to be fought, has to be dealt with. Islamophobia is not as a result of ignorance, my friends. Ignorance is not the worst thing that can happen, even though I often say ignorance is the enemy. There's something worse than ignorance. Can you think of what that is? It's miseducation. Miseducation. Why? Because ignorance is the absence of knowledge. And sometimes I'd rather somebody have no knowledge of something, and then, I have a clean blank slate to be able to contribute new information to that person and hopefully, positively shape their understanding of this particular phenomenon. But when somebody comes along and they have false information, they've been indoctrinated, they've been educated, quote unquote, on false information. Now they believe, I know, but they don't know. That is more dangerous, and that more accurately describes the state of the Islamophobes and Islamophobia in this country. If somebody came along and said, well, I don't know Muslims, but what is that? Even if they were prejudiced, it's out of ignorance, right? You can teach them something better. But if they come and say, I know who you are, you're trying to institute Sharia law. You're trying to enslave Americans. You're trying to overcome the Constitution. The less than 1% of you wants to rule and dominate in this country. You're a fifth column. You're trying to do jihad in America. That is the state of Islamophobia here. And let me also differentiate between two things: hate and fear. Fear is a natural phenomenon. It can be positive, it can be negative. Your fear of heights may save you from falling from a high rise, so it's a good thing. Gives you precaution. Your fear of people you don't know, strangers, well, maybe precautionary. Your fear of an entire ethnic group is problematic. But worse than fear, or different from fear, is hate. Why? Because fear is natural. A child can fear, right? A child can be afraid. But can a child hate? Have you ever met a child that hates? Have you ever met a child that says, I hate Koreans? Or I hate Latinos, right? A black child and a white child will play together. They probably wouldn't notice that they're much different. An Arab child and a Jewish child will play together and probably not notice that they're much different. It isn't until they grow up, if you want to call it that they begin to go, oh, wait a second. And they're listening to information and they're being indoctrinated with information. They go, oh, so that's what that person is and that's what I am. Boom, otherization. It's a process, it's acquired. Hate is acquired, unlike fear. It's a process of acquisition as a result of miseducation. But there's good news in that. Because while it's obviously worse than fear, it's easier to deal with, or it's more curable. Because while fear is inherent and hate is acquired, what's acquired can be de-acquired or unacquired, if you will. And so the process of education, proper education, can then help heal hatred. The process of enlightenment, the process of bringing to one's attention that all human beings are indeed equal. They're all of the same basic fabric, whether Muslim or not, whether Jewish or not, whether black or white or Latino or not. And that is at the forefront of what we must do as bearers of the legacy of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, who was amongst the first to institutionalize anti-discrimination. And as bearers of the legacy of a faith whose condemnation of racism was at its birth, the birth of creation itself in its worldview was based on non-racism and anti-racism. How then could we not be at the forefront of fighting for justice and equality for all people, not just for Muslims? And I warn us not to ghettoize our fight, our civil rights fight, to be only about us. Us versus those who don't like us. That isn't the fight. The battle that should be defined across the following lines. All Americans that believe in freedom, all Americans that believe in justice and human dignity and in the Constitution and in the promise of America, all of us banded together regardless of religion or background, and ethnic or racial background, all of us going against, educating, and oftentimes in court if we have to, through legal work, those who still believe that certain Americans or certain human beings are lesser than others. Discriminatory laws, discriminatory behavior. Those Americans of all backgrounds need to band together to challenge that. And whether it's CARE Chicago or CARE, or whether it's the MLFA and my dear brother Khalil Meek here, who has been leading a wonderful battle on behalf of all Muslims for many, many years to help bring justice to those who most need it and who can't pay for it. That battle, that fight for liberty and justice is an American one as much as it is a Muslim one. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Whether it's from the civil rights movement or before or since, it is American to stand up for your rights. It is American to say, I will not be discriminated against. I will not sit in the back of the bus. I will not stand up when I don't have to or sit down when I don't have to. To stand up for yourself, that is American. And so often in debates that I have with those who are Islamophobic, I remind them that regardless of what you say or what you think, in this dichotomy, we represent the spirit of America and you don't. Because we are the ones who are fighting and advocating for the values and the ideals that are enshrined in the Constitution. And you are the ones who are manipulating minds and exploiting minds and miseducating and indoctrinating with hate and fear. The consequences of that can be terrible. I don't expect this to happen in the United States, but look at what happened in Europe when a religious minority was systematically maligned and demonized for many years. It didn't happen overnight. They didn't just wake up and start rounding them up. For several years, perhaps decades, there were the cartoons and the editorials and the books and the lectures and the preachers and the theories and the new terminology and the narratives that there is this minority that is all powerful that wants to dominate. They're different. Their religion is different. They're vile. They're this. They will never be like us. They control that. They control this. They want to control all of us. They are the other. And before there was the brutal dictator and murderer Hitler, there were peaceful, nonviolent, hateful mongers who wrote books that Hitler later read and was influenced by. So let us not for a second fall into the trap that if it's not violent, it's okay. I'm all for freedom of speech, but I warn against hate speech. I warn against the consequences of hate speech and what it can do. And we've seen multiple times in history the consequences of that. Only recently in Norway with Anders Breivik, the Norwegian-born and Norwegian-raised terrorist who murdered dozens of people after being indoctrinated by radical right-wing hate mongers from the United States. To conclude, to give you a quick rundown of the nature of Islamophobia in this country, we need to differentiate between two groups, although they're both within the camp of Islamophobia. There's the vanguard. These are the leaders of the movement, of the theories, and then there's the followers. The great majority are amongst the followers, but this minority that it's in the leadership, it knows better. The rest are ignorant. This one is miseducating. There are two groups that tend to be at the forefront of, unfortunately, these theories and these beliefs. On one hand, you have the radical, fundamentalist, right-wing Christian groups in this country and communities and leaders. On the other, you have those who align themselves with a radical, right, Zionist, agenda. And I call it the way it is. The first group sees Islam as problematic because of their proselytizing ambitions. They feel that Islam is the only realistic rival, and they're afraid of what Islam can do in terms of winning hearts and minds in the West. And they feel that Islam is a heathen faith and that Christianity is the divine faith, and so they must, it's a religious war for them as far as they're concerned, to put it bluntly. For the radical Zionist elements, it is of the belief that Muslims are the last remaining camp that still says no and still is critical publicly and vociferously against the policies of the Licudists or the policy of the occupation in the Holy Lands. And that the only way to be able to silence their voices or at least render them inefficient is to delegitimize the community and delegitimize the faith. Obviously, there are many other factors that we can't get into because of the shortness of time that's left. But basically, these are two major movements under the camp of Islamophobia. And while, historically, they've been far apart, there has been a marriage of convenience of recent times, of convenience between the two in order to unite against this common target. And so, I want to conclude by reminding us that all this narrative, all this talk of Sharia law taking over, Muslims are not talking about that. How many times are we running around talking to each other about when is Sharia law going to take over? This whole talk about, violent jihad, which again, never really heard a Muslim talk about in my community. Right? This talk about being anti-freedom and anti-constitution, hating America, why do they hate us, all of that stuff. All of this is feigned. All of this is made up, fabricated by whom? By these elements for the most part, in order to distract from their agendas, to distract from what they're doing both in Washington and in the media. I wrote an article recently in the Huffington Post, and it declared that the radical right, not Islam, is the premier and real threat to the American way. It isn't Muslims that are pulling ads off television because they disagree with the programming that humanizes a particular community. It's the radical Christian right. It isn't Muslims that are trying to enforce the Quran into and onto the Constitution in American courts and schools and public places. It's the radical Christian right. It isn't American Muslims that are pushing for a religious agenda into politics in this country. It is the radical Christian right. American Muslims, for those who study our community, will tell you, have a clear agenda. We do have an agenda. You know what that agenda is? It's social justice. If you look at CARE, if you look at ISNA, if you look at ICNA, if you look at MAS, if you look at CIUGC locally, if you look at any of the organizations, new or old, MLFA, others, you will find that Muslims are gathering and organizing and mobilizing around, more often than not, social justice initiatives. whether it is civil rights or the injustices in the Holy Land or immigration reform or otherwise. You will find that in this country, at least that's what I can speak for, the American Muslim community has a strong social justice agenda and not a religious domination agenda. We know who has that agenda. And this whole Islam is a threat deal is but a smokescreen. A smokescreen for those who are working hard, and they're not just less than 1% as we are. They're in the millions, and they have billions of dollars, and they're organized, and they are making progress. And that is why it is a threat that we need to deal with. We need to talk about. And so I'm not one to just sit there and defend. I like to take it back. The counter-offense is important. I'm not going to be distracted from the real issue here. I will point out what is wrong and what we need to focus on and deal with. All of us who are here, citizens, permanent residents, otherwise, human beings, you have rights. If you break the law, the law deals with you. But if there is any attempt to marginalize you or demonize you or abuse your civil or human rights, your dignity, then we got an issue that we need to deal with, and we will deal with it. Our civil rights organizations are there to deal with that. You need to know that you have those rights, and never, ever forgo your rights. If you are in trouble, contact an attorney, contact one of your civil rights organizations, and seek legal assistance. We will give it to you happily, free of charge. But also educate yourself about the larger context, and believe in America, believe in humanity, believe that while we have been in worse places, we have overcome. Believe that other communities have risen with passion, with commitment, and changed that was wrong. America will not be Islamophobic forever, I promise you that. But be part of the change process. Don't sit on the sidelines and watch. And don't just stand up for yourself or for our community. Stand up for injustices and unfairness to any and all Americans. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you, Brother Ahmed, and thanks to all our panelists. They have been very eloquent in presenting the cases that are very important to us. I think in wrapping up and summarizing what all of them have shared with us today, it is one thing that we should come out with, and that is, if we do not believe in ourselves, in our rights, and that we are Americans before anything else, if we consider ourselves all the time that we're going to go back home, and we are not here really with our minds and with our heart, with our conscience, and the importance of what we can offer to this country, then I think we are going to bring a lot of this kind of things and to talk about. But the minute we believe in ourselves and how good we are contributing to this country, and that's why they're trying to come up with this, the so-called fear about Islam and the Sharia law, as if, as Brother Ahmed said, as if all our conventions here, we're talking about how we can implement the Sharia law in this country. There's none, although we have some responses we can tell about it. But I think one thing Brother Khalil mentioned, despite all of this, the system works. There is a due process. And you have to believe in this. You really need to take it to heart. Yes, there were cases of profiling and civil rights abuse and violations. And Brother Ahmed Rehab and CARE National and CARE Los Angeles and other places, they were able to win the cases. That means they went to court, they followed the process worked, and the court worked. So if we do not believe in this, if we do not believe that we do belong here now, then we are always going to be vulnerable to these kinds of attacks, and we're always going to fight. Actually, what worries me, not what those presidential candidates were willing to sell their principles for a festival of votes. They are flip-floppers, yes. They're willing to give up their principles and values in order to get acceptance to win. They don't worry me because they're politicians. That's what they are. They're willing to do this. What worries us is that there is a constituency out there that they are trying to appeal to, and they are willing to give up so that they please them. I don't think we have done our job to reach out to this constituency and tell them you don't have to fear us. You have to fear a president who is willing to compromise the value of this country that made it the country that brings all of us together. That's the fear that we should be all considering, but not us. So I think we have a job to do. We have a lot of work with our neighbors, with our organizations. They can fight the fire, but that is not a living thing for us. What's a living thing for us is what makes life enjoyable, peaceful, with tranquility. That's what makes life for us. It is not just all we have to do is keep fighting on this. We know that bigotry is not going to be over. It was with the black, it was with the Jews, it was with the Irish, it was with the Latinos. It is now with the Muslims. And as Brother Ahmed says, probably Islamophobia is going to fade, is going to come up with something else. But we do have a role to play. I want to thank all our panelists. They have enriched us with their input and what they have shared with us. I think we have a task ahead of us that we have to take to home and do some work there. I have a few announcements before we conclude. Sister Khalila, you have something to say?
Assalamu alaikum. For those of, if you have a question about someone who's out of status, someone that's subject to removal, someone that came in, not the word undocumented, but uninspected, tomorrow and today outside in the lobby, after Salatul Asr, we'll be there and you'll be able to ask questions and get legal advice. Also, I'm not sure of the time that the immigration clinic is scheduled, but if you have a problem, don't think that there's not a solution. There are lots of laws that are solutions and are applicable for people that have not adjusted their status. You know how difficult it's becoming to fly. You don't have identification. You don't have any way to be able to get on an airplane. And also, if you're a child or a youth whose parents came in here and the DREAM Act hasn't been passed, there are ways to overcome that too. So please, while we're here, let us help you if we can and come for information. Sign up for the clinic, or when we're at the desk, you'll be able to ask questions about immigration status, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.
Well, I think we have done a great job here as a wonderful audience like yourself coming early in the morning. We're talking about civil rights abuse and human rights, and I think we have a body rights. Many of us probably did not sleep enough last night and excited coming up to the conference. I know that I'm one of those, we would like to give a good round of applause for all our participants here who did a very good job this morning. I have a few announcements. First one is the Salah for women is going to be in the bar room corner, and the Salah for men is in room 8, 9, and 10. So please be careful with that and know exactly where you want to go. It is exactly 11:45, and we have been very punctual on our presentation today. Thank you very much for being a quite nice audience and listener, and thanks for our speakers here. They've been very good. Thank you.